Mike Leinbach and Jonathan Ward. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. How's everybody? Well, let's see. I'm Mike, and that's Jonathan.
Hi.
So we know who everybody is. I'd like to set a few expectations for the talk, if I could. First of all, we realize we're the last thing between the presentation and dinner, so we will try to finish on time. The other expectation I'd like to set is that we're going to talk about a subject that probably most of you have heard about. It's a tragedy in American manned spaceflight history, the loss of our Space Shuttle Columbia and her 7-man crew. But ultimately, the story is a very inspirational one, and that's our goal, is to try to get across to you all that even though we lost the orbiter and our astronauts, the end result is an inspirational story of Americans coming together and doing what we do best, is reacting in a time of crisis and helping each other out and getting over the emotional part of the reaction to the accident and really pitching in and doing whatever needed to be done in East Texas. And that's the expectation that we'd like to get across. Jonathan?
Yeah, I was thinking one of the things that always appealed to me as a lifelong amateur astronomer is that a great thing about amateur astronomy is that amateurs can contribute to the body of knowledge. And one of the things that's really appealing about this story that you'll hear as we go through here is how 25,000 wildland firefighters and volunteers from deep East Texas completed the International Space Station. It's kind of the way this story goes. So.
Yeah, to find the debris that allowed us to finish the station. That's right.
Okay, so people who had nothing to do with NASA ultimately saved the space station.
That's right. Okay. Well, let's see. We'd like to get everybody on the same page and talk about the accident a little bit, so we know the background. We launched on January 16th, 2003. It was a beautiful morning. I remember it like it was yesterday. We launched right on time. Had a crew of 7 on board the orbiter Columbia. Beautiful liftoff, and during the liftoff, you all may recall that a piece of foam insulation off the external fuel tank broke off and hit the leading edge of the left wing of the orbiter and caused some sort of a breach in the thermal protection system of the left wing and allowed hot gases to penetrate the wing upon re-entry. The foam of the external tank, the piece that came off was 1.2 pounds, about the size of a carry-on suitcase for an airliner, 1.2 pounds. And the foam, if you've ever used those cans of spray and insulation at home, seal around pipes, that type of stuff, it goes in wet and expands and dries. The foam on the external tank is very similar to that. A little fancier, I'll give you that, a little fancier, but nevertheless it was good insulation quality foam, and that broke off where the nose of the orbiter connected to the external fuel tank. The extent of the damage, we didn't know. We always reviewed launch videos starting, within an hour or so of liftoff. We reviewed still photographs from the ground and then ascent videos. That day, one of our ground cameras was inoperative. It just simply didn't work. And another one was out of focus, and so you'll see later in the presentation the best views we had of the foam hitting the orbiter, but they were not conclusive where the foam actually hit, nor did we know the extent of the damage. We debated it every day of the mission, and as we go through the presentation, you'll hear we incorrectly concluded it wasn't a problem and cleared the crew to come home, and we lost the crew upon re-entry. On February 1st, we gave the go for the deorbit burn out over the Indian Ocean and started the descent back home over California, and was going to transit over Texas and the Gulf Coast and over the Gulf of Mexico and into Florida. We lost contact with the orbiter over Texas, and again you'll see here shortly where the orbiter came down and our crew came down. The hot plasma gas got inside the left wing, and as the orbiter comes down, it gets lower and lower in the atmosphere, and therefore denser and denser atmosphere, hotter and hotter, slows down more and more, heat builds up even more, and that ionized oxygen at the very highest levels of the atmosphere got inside the left wing and caused the damage to the wing, and it first compromised the hydraulic system inside the wing, so the crew lost all steering, and then eventually the wing burned off. It melted from the inside out, and the left wing came off, orbiter went into a flat spin and broke up aerodynamically. Communications was lost over Dallas, and it disintegrated in an initial debris field about 250 miles long and 20 miles wide. I'd ask you to think about that. Think about something 250 miles from your house, probably another town, and 20 miles away. And that was the initial cut at our debris field when we first went out to Texas to set up the recovery operations.
So there were two searchers. We'll talk about this as we go through there. That unlike the Challenger accident, which was handled entirely by professional searchers, there were other searchers who were involved in this, and two of the searchers actually died during the course of the Columbia accident investigation. We'll talk about that. But that helped cement the bond between NASA and the local community there. And as we talk about this going forward, this became, searching that area that Mike talked about, the largest ground search operation in American history. And with over 100 federal, state, and local agencies coming together on this, it also became the largest peacetime cooperation of federal agencies and government agencies across the country. You know, the debris was brought back to Kennedy for reconstruction, which Mike was in charge of, and both the debris team that Mike was leading to try to determine the cause of the accident, and also the team from Johnson Space Center that was analyzing the telemetry from the vehicle, both came to the same conclusion, and that's what the NTSB had said, that if both the analysis of the debris and the analysis of the telemetry comes to the same conclusion, then you found the cause of the accident. We'll talk about how this is preserved now, and it's one of the things that we're most proud of is how Columbia still continues a scientific mission to this day. And you know, that allowed, the investigation allowed NASA to get the shuttle flying again a couple years later and eventually complete the International Space Station.
There's our crew, Commander Husband, horizontal in the front, having a great time. A truly international and diverse crew, Mike and Willie, Dave in the middle, Ilan Ramon, first and only Israeli astronaut, Laurel Clark, and Casey Chopna, an Indian American. Truly an international crew. We were very, very conscious of international cooperation and also diversity, and you see it in that picture.
You know, this was, Mike mentioned that Ilan was an Israeli astronaut, not an Israeli American, but he was the first Israeli to fly in space. And if you go back to thinking about what was going on in 2003 when this mission was launched, it was only 16 months after 9/11. And we had also, you know, we were at war in Afghanistan, we were debating going to war in Iraq, we had an Israeli on board the Space Shuttle, and so security was at an extraordinarily high level during that time. And that was consuming a lot of Mike's time, certainly with preparing the launch. There was even talk about trying to launch a day early by surprise to thwart potential terrorists. But this was a purely scientific research mission. They had a Space Hab double module in the cargo bay of the Space Shuttle. They were, you see here, you've got red team and blue team. They were conducting operations 24 hours a day. Mike Anderson was an astronomer. There were space science things on there. Laurel and Dave were both medical doctors, so they were running medical experiments on board. Ilan Ramon was studying dust cloud formation, sandstorm formations over the Middle East. So there was a lot of science that was going on board the Space Hab module for that mission.
One of the things we had to do in the investigation was clear the possibility that it was terrorism that brought the orbiter down. As Jonathan said, 16 months after 9/11, and it was ever since 9/11, we had a very, very elevated security posture at the Kennedy Space Center for all launches. And for this one, it was especially elevated with Ilan on board. And we did clear. It was not terrorism. It was simply the foam that came off the external tank that doomed the orbiter. Here you see a replay. This is one of the two best views we had of the foam, and Jonathan's pointing it out. Came off of an area up on the external tank with the nose connected to the tank, broke off and came down and shattered into those thousands of little bitty pieces when it hit the edge of the wing. This caused a lot of people on the ground, our film analysts, a lot of concern, obviously. That's the best view we ever had of it. And we, again, incorrectly concluded it wasn't a safety of reentry issue.
It was difficult to tell from this video whether it hit the front of the wing or if it hit the underside of the wing. And there was a lot of debate about whether it had compromised the wheel well of the orbiter. And, but again, it's one of those things where during the course of the debates, concerns like that never really got elevated to the extent that people were that concerned. And I think one of the things that we saw with Challenger, and again started happening with Columbia, was that we've gotten away with this before in the past. And the orbiter is pretty strong. It can survive just about anything. A little piece of foam like this isn't going to be able to bring down the orbiter. And so the management team kind of was able to convince itself that this is not a safety of flight issue. And they even relayed to the crew that this had happened, but we don't see that there's any risk to reentry going on.
And I'll jump ahead a little bit in the conclusion section, I guess you could say. Two things we learned from the Space Shuttle program. One, simply, was how to live and work in low Earth orbit for 2 weeks at a time. If you look at American manned spaceflight history leading up to the Space Shuttle, went to the moon and all good stuff, but it was a very evolutionary process. Shuttle taught us how to live and work in low Earth orbit. I would argue the most important thing the shuttle program taught us was how to deal with reusable spacecraft, the orbiter, and how we on the ground dealt with recurring problems and tended to, by human nature, tended to minimize their potential effect on the next flight. We had a specification for the tiles of the orbiter to have zero impact on the tiles. None, ever, zero. We had impacts every flight. We had minor damages every flight. We had a couple flights where we lost a tile, one flight where we lost a tile. So we got into a position where we were rationalizing problems based on previous flight history that it was okay for the next. That is the wrong thing to do. We became complacent, overconfident, and I would argue that it's human nature to do that. And future programs, the new entrants in the program, reusable spacecraft of the future, need to watch out for that. Very, very difficult problem to solve. It cost us 2 orbiters and 14 people.
Yeah, so this is Columbia's reentry path. As Mike mentioned, there was a deorbit burn over the Indian Ocean. Everything was going fine. It crossed the California coast at Edwards, and some of you may have seen video of the plasma trail as the orbiter was coming across. It was just before sunrise out at California, and people were noticing unusual sparking in the plasma trail as the vehicle started to come down. They would see little bright flashes every once in a while. And this was caught on video. There was almost nearly continuous video coverage from amateurs on the ground of the space shuttle as it crossed the country. As it crossed over Dallas, communication was lost with the vehicle, and it was kind of thought that this was at first a typical type of communications dropout during a blackout that can happen when plasma engulfs the vehicle. But it was headed towards Kennedy Space Center, where Mike was on the runway waiting for it to come home.
The best part of my job, I get asked a lot, what was the best part of your job, Leinbach? And it was greeting the crew when they'd get off the orbiter at the Kennedy Space Center. End of a mission, astronauts were home safe. So I got to greet the crew, and so we were waiting by the side of the runway, 100 yards off the runway, and we had a large countdown clock between the shuttle landing facility, the concrete runway, and where we were standing, and it would count down to the time that Columbia should have been right in front of us. 3 minutes and 15 seconds before every touchdown, you all probably remember the double sonic booms of the nose of the orbiter first, and then the vertical stabilizer, the tail, breaking the sound barrier. That's 3 minutes and 15 seconds. We did not hear that. That was when my heart began to sink. And then that countdown clock went down to 0. The orbiter should have been right in front of us, and it was just not there. We didn't know where it was. We had no idea where Columbia was. It had to be, it was somewhere between orbit and the Kennedy Space Center. We had no idea where it was. Parallel confusion, real quick. We in Florida, we didn't know where it was. The folks in East Texas, Jonathan we'll talk about the folks in East Texas. They didn't know what the heck was going on when the orbiter was coming out of the sky.
It's, you know, what a contrast to what was going on with the folks in Kennedy were hearing nothing but silence, and Mission Control in Houston was hearing silence. The people who were along the path, starting at just southeast of Dallas all the way over to the Louisiana border, started hearing this rumbling sound which grew louder and louder and eventually was reaching the point where it was constant banging and booming that was shaking houses to their foundations, causing things to fall off shelves. It was amazing the people we talked to who were along that reentry path who heard, one person thought that either New Orleans or Houston had been destroyed in a nuclear explosion. People were thinking that maybe the pipeline, cross-country pipeline had exploded, or the trains had derailed, or that there were mid-air collisions going on, because some people went outside and saw smoke trails spiraling through the sky. A lot of the people didn't realize there was a space shuttle flying overhead. And so this was part of the confusion for them. They didn't know what was going on. And it turned out what they were hearing was more than 80,000 pieces of Columbia breaking the sound barrier in a continuing cacophony that lasted for several minutes. And for the next half hour, Columbia fell out of the sky. The heavier pieces continued to go at Mach 2 all the way till they hit the ground. Lighter pieces started falling out of the sky earlier.
Courage, compassion, and commitment. Boy, this describes the whole effort. Landing day became recovery day 1. We assembled a group of people. The catastrophic event happened 40 miles high, 12,000 miles per hour. That's the combination of the speed and the density of the atmosphere against the orbiter. It's almost like max Q during ascent, where all the forces come together at a maximum. It typically happens around this altitude, and it did with Columbia. Local residents were the first responders. When we were holding our first meeting in the Launch Control Center at Kennedy Space Center, trying to figure out what to do, our first astronaut was being found on the ground. We had no idea. We established our priorities, obviously to protect the public first, to find the crew second, and then to bring back the orbiter itself as best we could.
And this is the area where Mike talked about this 250-mile long by 20-mile wide debris area. So this is initially the area where the majority of Columbia came down. The lighter pieces fell to the earth out by the Dallas area, and then some pieces of the main engines, which were the heaviest and densest, continued on at a supersonic path until they hit the ground in Louisiana, going Mach 2. And so this became the area of concentration where you had FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was taking charge of the emergency response. NASA had astronauts coming up from Houston. Mike and his team were coming over from Kennedy to Barksdale Air Force Base to set up a staging area there to do the accident investigation. And so you had, in the course of that first day, it was like a flash mob of agencies all kind of descending on the area there to start taking charge of what was going on here. And it was a fascinating story to talk to the people who were involved, because nobody really knew who was in charge, but they very quickly figured out how to work together, and was very little infighting, actually almost no infighting that we were aware of. That people naturally just kind of learned to, okay, you do your thing, you do my thing, how can we help out with each other and take over from there? And so this was what was being found on the ground throughout East Texas. As you see here, the local police started coming out and investigating these sightings of things on the ground. They tried to position an officer by each piece, and after a while, after a few minutes, they ran out of officers to be able to post around here. And so eventually, they started roping things off. And again, as Mike mentioned, when the first of the crew was found, that became a priority for a lot of the local people to try to find those folks. And then Mike talked about protecting the public, and you can see here's one of the hyper tanks from Columbia that still had hypergolic propellant on board, landing in some people's backyard. It was amazing that there was nobody on the ground injured as a result of this, and there was almost no property damage as a result of the explosion too.
We had a piece of debris go through the roof of a school and land by the teacher's desk, but it was Saturday morning. School was not in session.
Yeah.
So bottom line, we didn't hurt anybody on the ground due to the direct accident itself.
And that was Administrator O'Keefe's first first comment to you in the Launch Control Center was when the video finally came through of Columbia breaking up, his first, well, I guess, tell him what he said.
Yeah, it was, I remember that extremely well too. We went from the viewing area alongside the runway to my office in the Launch Control Center, and our administrator was with us, Sean O'Keefe, and his deputy and a couple other folks. And it was in my office we first saw that CNN replay of the debris and the streaks in the sky and all that. You've probably seen that. And Sean put his hands on my desk and looked at that video and said, "I wonder how many people on the ground we just hurt." And the answer is 0. But his first concern was people on the ground. This is a crater created by a main engine turbo pump from one of the 3 main engines on the shuttle, beginning to fill in with water. Our turbo pump is about this big around, looks sort of like a beer keg, for those of you that know what a beer keg looks like. And this was about 12 feet down in the dirt, down in the mud. And the only way we found it was there was mud scattered up on the side of the trees inside in the forest where this came down. We looked down and we saw that crater. It impacted the ground at Mach 2, as Jonathan said. We had 6 turbo pumps, 2 per engine, 3 engines, 6 turbo pumps, and we found 3 of them. So there are three of the other 3 are still out there somewhere. This is the power head of the main engine where the fuels come together to fuel the main engine. Yeah. Again, a once pristine Space Shuttle main engine reduced to that.
As people began to realize that the crew had also come to Earth, the local communities there, particularly in Sabine County, Texas, which is right on the Louisiana border, immediately mobilized. One of the things that most impressed me about the story was the capacity of local emergency responders. You think about small towns. I wouldn't think of them having well-trained people who know how to go out and deal with a crisis, but they immediately had a crisis management plan, put together emergency response teams, and you had that first several days, you had volunteers streaming in from all over the place. This little town of Hemphill, Texas, went from 1,000 people to 3,000 people overnight as people descended on the town to try to help out with the search. A lot of them were volunteers. A lot of them were state troopers and other people who came to that area. One of the most amazing stories that we found was, with a little tiny town like that, is that there's maybe 1 or 2 restaurants in town, one of which was called Fat Fred's, and no hotels in town or anything like that. And the wife of the VFW commander said, we need to turn the hall into some way to start dealing with all these volunteers who need food and shelter. He said, ask her to start making phone calls, and she started making hundreds of phone calls, and within the course of a couple of days had organized this amazing feeding effort there for all of the volunteers and the police who had come to town to help out. In the course of the first 12 days after the accident, entirely done by volunteers, literally little old ladies bringing in fried chicken and cornbread and things like that. They fed somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 meals done voluntarily in this small town, at no cost to the government, just completely out of the goodness of their own heart. And these people also opened their houses up. We had searchers who were sleeping in cars, and the local residents opened their houses up and offered to people to come and stay at their houses, to do their laundry for them. It was just an incredible outpouring.
And that's part of the inspirational side of the story I hope you get out of this, is that the people in East Texas and then all the people that descended on East Texas to help us out were just good Americans doing what was right. And it was wonderful to see. And in the face of the tragedy, you try to compartmentalize the emotional side of losing your friends, and you get into the job you've been assigned. And the local people did that same thing. They just knew what had to be done and when to do it, and they just stepped up. They didn't ask for anything more than a thank you. The good people of Sabine County, Texas. As time went on, we were able to narrow down the debris zone, both by where we were finding it and also some computer analysis, but mostly by where we were finding it. I remember the first day out there, we had a big map on a wall inside a hangar at the Barksdale Air Force Base where we first set up shop. And we were putting those little colored pins with the little round ball on the top. We were putting push pins in this map to try to figure out where Columbia was. And it over time devolved, and we got down to a zone 120 miles long and 10 miles wide, which we physically walked. We walked 120 miles long, 10 miles wide, from about me to Jonathan. We walked that in the course of 3 months, looking for the orbiter and our crew. We found the crew relatively quickly, but it took fully 3 months to find what was left of the orbiter.
Yeah. Yeah, the crew recovery was all done within the first 12 days. The first astronaut was found the first day, 2 more the next day, 2 the day after that, but then there was a period of about 9 days where, before the last 2 were found. And again, this was all mostly done with National Guard and volunteers who were searching there, and the local landowners who were also searching their own land. But it was extremely inhospitable type of terrain. It was cold and rainy and sleeting and snowing and muddy, and the briars are literally 2 inches thick on some of the branches, and there people were walking in. Folks from NASA who came out to help out with the search would walk in, and within hours their clothes were completely shredded. And and so it was one of those things where people were just not prepared for conditions except for the locals. And again, it was one of the things that NASA was most grateful for, was that the locals could help out that same way.
And I should say the treatment of the crew was very, very respectful. Whenever we found a crew member, everything stopped, and we assigned an astronaut, clergy, the local funeral director, state police, and FBI. And those 5 would go out and take care of the remains. And when the astronaut friend gave the high sign, then the remains were removed. Yeah. And it was treated that way, and the prayers that were said in different languages for Elon and for KC, and it was done very, very respectfully. All 7 were returned to their families for internment.
For me, talking to some of the astronauts who were involved in the recovery of going out to look for their friends, you wonder emotionally. I was trying to figure out how you could go about doing that, and of course a lot of these folks are military, and you never leave a fallen comrade in the field, and I think that was part of what they were feeling there, was that they wanted to be part of this, but it was a very emotionally draining thing for them. One of the rules that they set up was that no astronaut could do this more than 3 days before they had to come back and then go through psychological counseling and go back again, because that's how tough the duty was for them to be able to go through that. So again, when you think about the glamour that astronauts have, think about also the types of really tough things that they have to do too. They're really amazing people.
Picking up the pieces, first operation in the new Department of Homeland Security. Jonathan mentioned over 100 federal, state, local, and volunteer agencies came together seamlessly to do what was right. People were just showing up and say, what can I do? And they'd be assigned a task. We had a senior engineer show up in a Mercedes-Benz from Texas, from Houston, and he ended up sweeping the floor because the floor needed sweeping. It's that type of reaction that these 25,000 people chipped in. You can see some of the statistics there. On either side of the area that we walked, we flew with helicopters looking down for debris on either side of the main debris field, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. And again, largest ground search in American history.
Yeah, we mentioned that the astronauts were returned to their families. 2 air searchers were killed, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. Again, very lucky that nobody on the ground was injured. But a saying quickly began circulating around the townsfolk in Sabine County and Hemphill. They were saying that Columbia's mission, their mission, has become our mission, to go out and help find these astronauts. And after the 2 searchers were killed in the helicopter crash, that became even more cemented in the lingo of that town. They had literally just the week before the accident, they had commissioned or had dedicated this big Texas Lone Star that was made out of tile that was sitting at the main intersection of town, just a big white star, and that became a place for people to leave flowers and teddy bears and other memorials for the crew. After the accident, they went back and had that changed to a star with Columbia's logo in it, and then with the words "their mission became our mission" put on top of that to remember that. They are commemorating that to this day. 38% of the orbiter was recovered by weight. The NTSB had originally said maybe 5% would be recovered, so a lot more of Columbia came to ground than was expected. 84,000 pieces weighing over 40 tons. Most of those pieces that came back were smaller than a square inch. So again, think about pieces that small being found by foot, people walking by foot over densely forested area.
And that represented, that amount of debris was more than 10 times all previous debris from any spacecraft that entered anywhere on Earth combined. And so we knew we had a tremendous resource, engineering, material science resource, in addition to finding it and learning what caused the accident and fixing it so we could fly again. That fact that we had so much of Columbia really informed one of the decisions that we'll talk about in just a second.
Yeah, after the last of the crew were found, NASA said, we don't want to put any more people in harm's way, we don't want to be harming volunteers, and it's inefficient to try to search the rest of this debris field with volunteers. And so another surprising thing for us and to NASA at the time was that the U.S. Forest Service came forward and said, we have these wildland fire crews who are used to looking for smoldering pockets of embers after a forest fire. They're trained to do what's called grid searching, where you walk in a straight line across an area and look for things. They could be trained to look for debris. And so in the course of just a few days, the Forest Service started bringing in literally thousands of people from all over the country. 42 states ended up being involved. Crews of 20 people that came as self-contained crews. And here's an example of one set up, this is a tent city in Nacogdoches with a bunch of fire crews that brought their own, they bring their own tents, they have their own feeding operations, and so they ran this very efficiently with 20 people per Forest Service team accompanied by somebody from NASA and somebody from the EPA. This is the helicopter crew that was lost on March 23rd, I believe, and this is actually the day of their accident. They were stopping for refueling and for lunch. And this gentleman, Buzz Meir, was the pilot. He ran air tours out of the Grand Canyon and came over to help out with this. Charles Krennick from the Texas Forest Service is on the end there. There's two gentlemen from Kennedy Space Center and another Forest Service worker. And as the helicopter was searching at treetop level, which they had over 35 helicopters searching at treetop level on the outside of the debris zone, the fuel pump suddenly quit and the helicopter crashed to the ground, and it killed the pilot and Charles Krennick instantly. The other gentlemen were seriously injured, but they survived. But again, this was one of those things where complacency had kind of taken over. The searchers knew that they were operating in a dangerous area. They were flying kind of in the dead man zone, but it was important to them to try to find debris on the ground, and suddenly realized, we're putting people in harm's way just to do a salvage operation. We need to step back. So everybody stepped back. They took a week off and reevaluated the safety of air operations going forward again. But it was one of those things that, again, the enthusiasm to try to accomplish the mission overshadowed good sense.
Well, see, that's a shot of Toledo Bend Reservoir in between Louisiana and East Texas. Typical shot of dive operations. There were many bodies of water that we ended up diving. Did over 3,000 dives and only found 2 little pieces of debris. We talked to some of the local residents out there when Jonathan and I went out for the 15th anniversary this past February, and we were talking to a couple of the fishermen, and they said there was stuff landing in the water all around them. So we know there are bits of debris inside or at the bottom of this reservoir. We just couldn't find it. A shot of one of the easier zones to walk. You can see the spacing of the individuals there.
Yeah.
A lot of the zones that were walked were very, very thickly wooded with pine forests and brambles and thorns 2 inches long and just terrible. But the guys and gals just kept walking, and they'd lay their walking stick down to try to lay the brambles down so they could walk over them, and they just didn't give up. They just kept going.
So again, just imagine covering every square foot of an area, 12,000 square miles like that, just 1,200 square miles like that, yeah.
Bittersweet victory. Reconstruction revealed the cause of the accident. Let's see, as Jonathan mentioned, we set up 2 teams initially, the data team out of the Johnson Space Center looking at all video and telemetry from the orbiter and videos that were sent in from the public and from our Department of Defense friends and et cetera. And then the reconstruction team that we put together back at the Kennedy Space Center. All the debris was collected and sent up to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, and essentially boxed up there, packaged there, and shipped back to the Kennedy Space Center where we did the reconstruction. A couple pictures coming up here. We say reconstruction, you'll see it really wasn't quite reconstructing the orbiter. It just wasn't enough there, and the pieces were too small. Preserving and learning from Columbia. Yeah. What can we say?
We'll get into that. I think
we'll get into
minutes,
that. And the effect on the shuttle program. We'll talk a bit about that too. This is Columbia on the floor of the hangar next to the shuttle landing facility at the Kennedy Space Center, about 2 months into the recovery. So we had about another month to go of recovering debris and shipping it back. This view of the orbiter, the nose is pointing towards you.
So it's
upside down, belly up, and it's just the underside of the orbiter. Off to the side, we have the vertical stabilizer, et cetera, but really just the belly of the orbiter, because that was the area we were concerned with, was the thermal protection system, the tiles and the reinforced carbon. And looking at that, a lot of the debris we got back were involved with different systems on board the shuttle, fueling systems, electrical systems, payload systems. Those we put off to the side in crates, essentially. We know where every piece is. We can go get it within about 10 minutes. It's all at the vehicle assembly building at KSC right now. But it didn't relate to the accident. So what we laid out on the floor in that picture was just the belly of the orbiter.
Every piece that came back, as Mike mentioned, was bagged and tagged. The GPS coordinates were taken on every piece that came back. This is the hatch window from the crew exit escape hatch, but you can see that there's there's an ID associated with that. As Mike said, it's all entered in a database. It's all geolocated so that you can go through and take a look at something like this, which, as they went back and started looking at pieces and identifying where they came on the shuttle, it started telling a very compelling picture about how the shuttle broke up. So these are pieces of the left wing, these are pieces of the right wing. And so you can see that the left wing obviously failed first. That's how the debris started telling the story about what was going on with Columbia.
We had reports of debris from the California coast to Florida, and we investigated them all. And the furthest west piece we ever found was from a little town in West Texas, Littlefield. There was a tile off the orbiter. That was the furthest west piece. The furthest east piece was a part of one of our main engines. Again, the ballistic characteristics were such, the weight was such that it traveled the furthest east and landed in a golf course and created another hazard in the golf course. But that was the furthest east piece. But we investigated all calls into our recovery center. This is a table, a tile table. We got to the point where we were laying individual tiles on the floor of this hangar. Really couldn't study them that well being down low. So we built a tile table. We laid out a map of where each tile went. And as the tiles came back with their individual number on them, we put them in the proper place on the wing, along with the leading edge of the wing. And here in a second, I think we'll see there's the leading edge. Look at that guy. There's the leading edge of the wing, the left wing of the orbiter. It's a reinforced carbon material, which is very like a fiberglass, very dense fiberglass. It's an interwoven material and then impregnated with a resin and pressed and heated and cured to the proper shape. We built these frames so we could see the outside of the leading edge, and then walk behind. You could see the inside as well, and then we could see how the slag was being laid down as the plasma gas got inside the wing. It was melting, and some of the molten material went forward, some of it went aft. And we were able to trace that slag by sectioning that slag, so we could see what melted first, second, third, fourth, like that. This arrangement really helped us quite a bit because we could see the inside, outside at the same time.
Yeah. And going through and looking at some of these pieces, some of these are little tiny pieces the size of your thumbnail, but engineers were able to go through and figure out, even using micrometers, to figure out the thickness as to where that would go and which part of the RCC on which panel. It was just amazing that they were a fantastic forensics work to make that kind of thing happen.
This is Orbiter Experimentation Box, OEX box. It's a data recorder. It's a magnetic tape data recorder that was inside one of the avionics bays in the crew module of Columbia. Columbia being the first orbiter built, was instrumented with hundreds of sensors all over the ship, thermocouples, acoustics, vibration, temperature, all sorts of sensors, and all that data was fed into this recorder during ascent and entry, just those 2 times. And so obviously we knew we had a tremendous amount of data on this recorder, and that became one of the most highly sought pieces of debris. And you can tell by the box it was in pretty good shape. We just lost a few turns of the mag tape on the outside of the reel, but we got a lot of good information off of that box.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah, this box was found on the day that the U.S. went to war in Iraq, and so again to kind of pin that day for you in terms of what was going on in the context of the country as a whole. Some of the news networks broke in with a little bit of a feeder at the bottom saying that Columbia's black box had been found. But this was really kind of like the holy grail for the data team, because when Columbia was coming in, the telemetry dropped out for 30 seconds, and then the black box helped them to be able to piece together that 30 seconds before the orbiter actually broke up. And so this confirmed what Mike's team had found on the ground with the debris as well.
The debris now is stored in a controlled room inside the vehicle assembly building. That man is Mike Cianelli. He's essentially the curator of the debris now. Again, 84,000 pieces. We have each piece individually numbered. We can get to any piece anytime we want it. He has created a new Apollo, Challenger, Columbia lessons learned program, the 3 fatal American manned spaceflight programs. And he goes around and teaches lessons learned from our 3 major accidents, and bases a lot of it on Columbia, a lot of it on Challenger, and some on Apollo.
One of the things that Mike is very proud of, and I'm glad to tell this story for him, is that one of the things that happened with Challenger after the accident investigation was over was that the attitude at the time was, let's bury Challenger and forget about it. Let's put it in a silo, put it behind us, and move on. So Challenger is buried in a Minuteman missile silo on Cape Canaveral. It's got a thick concrete cap over top of it so nobody can go in there. Mike, after studying Columbia, realized, as we said earlier, that Columbia represented a tremendous learning opportunity, and so he advocated to the administrator of NASA, who very quickly agreed with him that Columbia needed to be preserved rather than buried. And so it's thanks to Mike's initiative that Columbia is still there as a learning opportunity.
And we lend out that debris. Mike runs that program as well. He lends out debris to institutions, academic institutions, and other corporations that study, material science. We have a lot of different materials that we got back from the orbiter. Structural design. One of the seats had a large torsional twist in it. And so the idea, of course, is to build better and safer spacecraft of the future. And indeed, the seats that are being designed and the spacecraft you just had a briefing on were designed in part based on the reaction of Columbia's seats during her accident.
Yeah. This is a view inside the debris room. It's not accessible to the general public. However, all new employees at Kennedy Space Center, whether they're NASA or contractor, are strongly encouraged to go through the Columbia room very early in their tenure there, because NASA feels it's important for the employees who are working at Kennedy, who are processing the next spacecraft to go up, to understand the consequences of making a decision or not making a decision. Everything you do, no matter how mundane your job may be, may result in this kind of damage to a spacecraft or to a community. And so here's some representative pieces are on display to tell the story of Columbia here. You'll see on the left-hand side is what's left of the hatch and the tunnel that led between the orbiter middeck and the space hab module. You'll see some of the thrusters in the back there.
Different tanks that we got back. The orbiter, of course, had a lot of gases and fluids on board, and the tanks typically vented when they were breached, and then became light and big, and so they slowed down the atmosphere and just kind of fell out of the sky in the western debris zone mostly. One thing that Mike Cianelli is very proud of is that there are 3 people today that have their PhD based on studying Columbia's debris. And so it's a true success story, and Columbia continues her mission of scientific research and engineering study and material science. that's a real success story. My view.
Absolutely.
Forever remembered. If you go to the Kennedy Space Center at the Visitor Center, we have the window frames from Columbia on display. Inside the Atlantis exhibit, you get to see Atlantis up close and personal, and on the first floor of that building, you get to see the window frames from Columbia, as well as a piece of the sidewall from Challenger that came up off the floor of the ocean back in '86. There's Forever Remembered. So this is a room in the Visitor Center, Atlantis building. You can see the sidewall of Challenger on the left. In fact, that piece was so large it had to be cut in half to be lowered down inside the Minuteman missile silo many, many years ago. And then the window frames from Columbia on the right. And they are in the same state they were in when we found them. There are shards of glass in the corners. There's mud and grass caked in there. And we just put them in there as they were found.
It's a very powerful thing to see, definitely. And it's, again, tribute to Mike Chinelli and to the administration at Kennedy Space Center to work with the families of both Challenger and Columbia to have them understand the importance of educating the public on NASA's failures as well as the successes.
Mm-hmm. And a shameless plug for the book.
Yeah, 3 years ago, 2 weeks ago, Mike and I met for lunch one day just to kind of get to know each other after the funeral of a mutual friend. And at the end of lunch, Mike said, I always wanted to write a book about Columbia, and I had just finished writing 2 books about the Apollo program. And I thought, boy, this sounds interesting. Let's talk about that some more. And so watch what you volunteer for. And 3 years later, it originally started off as a story about Mike and his team, and it quickly grew. The more people we talked to that said, you've got to tell the whole story about the people in Texas. And so we've written this specifically as a non-technical book. Anybody can read it. It's very emotionally powerful. One of the great things about working with Mike is that he's very free about sharing what he's feeling, and a lot of the folks we talked to, like astronauts or researchers or people on the ground in Texas, were very open about sharing their emotional journey too. And so I think you'll find it's a very powerful book. We'll have copies outside the door here. If you're interested, we'll be signing books after the talk. So that concludes it for us. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Okay.
For over a decade, the FirstScope has been one of our customers' favorite products. It's easy to use, affordable, and provides really impressive views for a scope of its size. When the time came to update the FirstScope, I teamed up with renowned lunar imager Robert Reeves to create a telescope that would inspire the next generation of amateur astronomers to explore the moon.
Hello, my name is Robert Reeves. For the past 59 years, the moon has been my passion. Why? Well, the moon is the closest world to Earth. The moon is in our sky almost every night. The moon is close enough that we can see amazing detail on the surface with even modest telescopes.
The Robert Reeves Signature Series FirstScope is more than just a telescope. It's your guide to the moon. The telescope tube is a map of the moon's most notable features so you can learn the moon's geography. This telescope walks you through the basics and unlocks the entire hobby of astronomy, making it fun, easy, and accessible for everyone.
So I invite you to get out under the stars and enjoy a voyage to the moon.